Okay, so last week we nearly finished chapter 7. We ended with the last two questions. We were actually finishing up the second to last question as the bell rang last week. From chapter 7 in our book, Mind Your Faith. What do you think Paul knew how do you think Paul knew so much about the historical Jesus? And of course, as we discussed, Paul was very educated, and of course things that took place regarding Jesus and the apostles and the miracles did not happen in a corner. Certainly Paul was aware of many of the things that took place. It's not recorded that he actually ever saw Jesus in person, but that it certainly would have heard a lot of things that had happened from the Christians that he persecuted. But then add to that fact, in Galatians chapter 1, Paul says that he received his gospel not from man, not from Peter or John, but from whom? From Christ. Okay, so ultimately, how did Paul know so much? Christ told him. Certainly would be the be-all and end-all answer to that, is that Christ shared that information with him. All right, the last question, this is a question that Doy didn't have in there, but I thought he kind of covered the concept in the chapter. What are the implications of what Paul says in Galatians 1, 6 through 9, as it pertains not only to the resurrection, but to salvation and the veracity of the, quote, late writings? Doy kind of talked a little bit about the reason he picked up on the testimony of Paul, that's chapter 7 title, was because, again, kind of taking this historically minimum approach. If skeptics are going to argue that the Gospels were written 30 or 40 or 50 years after the death of Jesus, and that's too far past to discuss or debate, fine. Well, then let's talk about what Paul wrote that was only 20 to 25 years after Jesus was raised. And so that's why Doy focuses on the testimony of Paul in chapter 7. But if what Paul says is true in Galatians 1, verses 6 through 9, remember he starts out saying that he's marveling that the Galatians are so soon turned away to another gospel, which isn't another gospel, it's a perversion of the gospel of Christ. And then he goes on to emphasize the fact that if he or the apostles or even an angel from heaven teach any other gospel than what they had received, let him be accursed. That being the case, what are the implications as it pertains to the resurrection and salvation and the veracity of the late writings? What does that imply about salvation and the resurrection? Okay, so they have everything they need. All right, Paul says you've got everything that you need to know, not only for salvation, but certainly to maintain that salvation in service to God, both individually, as a church, as a congregation of God's people. Certainly Galatians written to a group of congregations, not just one. But what also does that say about the veracity of the late writings? Even though the writings of the Gospels may have been, starting in the 50s AD, 60s AD, and further, what does that say? Did Paul himself often quote the words of Jesus? Do many of those words of Jesus parallel what were said in the Gospels? Okay, and just the fundamental basics that Paul taught regarding Jesus and where he was from and what he did and what happened all parallel what the Gospels record. So that means that everything the Gospels record, there's no reason to question those things. Okay, now if there was a disconnect between what Paul wrote 2 decades after the resurrection and then later what the Gospels wrote, then you might have a case. But there is no disconnect. They all harmonize together. And of course, ultimately, Paul tells Timothy what about Scripture? It's all inspired of God. All Scripture is inspired of God. And that phrase, inspired of God, y'all remember what that means literally? God breathed. God breathed. And certainly that applies to the New Testament Scriptures just as much as Paul was acknowledging Old Testament Scripture. Any thoughts or comments through that last question there?
Well, it's just funny that the naysayers want to say that it was written too far away, but yet they accept other documents that were hundreds of years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, in chapter 8, Doyle even brings out a little bit of he doesn't use the term hypocrisy. What he questions is the consistency that is being applied to all documents of history. But that's what ultimately it is. It's hypocrisy to say, well, when it comes to the Gospels and the biblical texts, we're going to question that if it's beyond 25 or 30 years after the event in question. But then they take as gospel, to coin a phrase, writings that are written hundreds of years after other individuals lived. And so it's kind of, there's a double standard there being used. Yes, ma'am?
What was the average lifespan of a man during Christ?
About 60 years old.
So even if they were of Christ's age or younger, they would still be within their lifetime at
Sure.
having seen or heard talk to Christ.
Well, and keep in mind, I mean, John, he lived into the 90s AD. Most estimates put him in the late 90s AD. All right, so you got to figure that if Paul was teaching something wrong, or if Matthew, Mark, and Luke had gotten something wrong, don't you think John would have addressed that somehow, some way, either in his own gospel or in his letters?
Well, even the other Christians that had heard from Peter and all those other people.
Right.
You know, I mean, because they had an oral tradition, if you called people out or you corrected their mistakes if they made them.
Right.
And so, and plus because they had scribes, and those people, I mean, their life depended on them getting it right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we're talking about the people that wrote these lived when Christ lived. Even if they were younger, there were still people around, eyewitnesses, that could correct any errors, whether they were lay people like us, you know, Pentecost Day converts, they would still correct. I mean, they heard Peter directly.
Right.
So there was all kinds of people around to say, you got this right or you didn't.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Anything else through that? All right. Let's move on to chapter 8. So our goal for today is to actually finish chapter 8. Whether or not if we get it all and we end early, then so be it. But our goal is to start and finish chapter 8. So chapter 8, I think, is actually really interesting. It's a little bit of a shorter chapter. He's going to make up for that in chapter 9. Chapter 9 is a much longer chapter. But it's interesting because chapter 8, he kind of then progresses to describe, okay, so skeptics argue that because Paul was a believer, because the gospel writers were believers, you can't take their word for it because they were biased for Jesus. First of all, just because they believed in Jesus, does that make them wrong in what they recorded? No. Okay, that doesn't make them wrong. And they argue that well, hostile testimony or hostile accounts need to confirm these things, which that's not true. That's generally not how you go about looking at historical record anyway. But kind of the first little third of chapter 8, what have others said, is kind of his describing how to go about using non-biblical sources, historical sources, to kind of help confirm to people some of the facts of the gospel. So he describes how that the gospels they're independently written sources. And I think that's important for us to remember, that in the Bible we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's that way for a reason, because those are the four gospels. But these men wrote at different times to different audiences for different reasons. Okay, John's gospel was written much later than the other three, written in the 90s AD to a group of people who, by and large, I mean, there were no more apostles save for John. Okay, and specifically John wanted to address Well, what aspect of Jesus did John emphasize in the Gospel of John and in his letters? Yeah, okay. And then he became flesh and dwelt among us. Okay, and one of the arguments that was being made in John's time was that God can't be flesh because the flesh is inherently sinful. So Jesus, he came to earth, but he appeared like a man. He wasn't really human. And so John emphasizes the human part, the human elements, the human aspect of Jesus, both in the Gospel of John as well as in his first letter of John. He emphasizes, yes, the deity of Jesus, that he is God in the flesh, and also the humanity, the fact that he was in the flesh. He emphasizes both of those. But Doy talks about the fact that these four independent sources provide us with information about Jesus, as well as the writings of Paul 20 or 25 years after the resurrection. These were not originally written together or written in collusion with each other. They stand as their own sources and should be considered as such, despite them all being together in the book we call the Bible. Of course, all of these things eventually were put together, recognizing these letters were written by men inspired of the Holy Spirit. Many of them were the apostles that wrote these, or well, mainly Peter and John, obviously, or Peter and John and Paul. And so some will argue that these writers were biased and therefore should not be believed. And then Doy makes the point as if only hostile sources provide good information. Well, as we're going to talk about a little bit, sometimes hostile sources have reasons not to record certain things. It makes them look bad, or there's politics involved. And so just because hostile sources may not record something doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so that's a bogus complaint that hostile sources have to provide countering or supporting information. And this is where Doy brings up, again, he doesn't use the term hypocrisy, but he says if this were the case, then modern skeptics' arguments would be invalid because they're hostile against the belief in Jesus and the resurrection, and their thought process against any possibility of the supernatural. It tilts the whole thing the wrong way. That's not how you establish history. Thoughts or comments through that? Are there other sources outside of the Bible that record information about Jesus and the Christians? Yes, Doy says, there are many. However, there are two important points to remember when we consider them. So what Doy's going to do, he's going to go through a list of some of the main examples of outside, non-biblical, non-Christian historical sources that mention Jesus and the Christians and events of the New Testament. But when we consider those outside sources, there are two main points that he wants us to remember. We should not expect ancient non-Christian sources to sound like Christians. They are not writing in support of Jesus or of the miracles. They are simply recording a fact or two about Christ or Christians in the process of discussing and documenting their own concerns at the time that happened to confirm the history recorded by the New Testament. And I thought that was a good point to make. It's not like these individuals are there for the purpose of confirming the veracity of the Gospels, for instance. Okay, in the process of dealing with their own issues, their own politics, their own accounting of history, it's appropriate at that point to bring up this group of Christians or Jesus or whatever in kind of almost in passing. And certainly it would never have been their intent to offer anything that would have been supportive of the truth of the gospel. In fact, Doy even mentions the fact that many of this is done unintentionally. It's not like it was on purpose, but they did record them. And then the second thing he mentioned is do not expect the ancient sources to record every event that the gospel accounts record about Jesus. Very few historical accounts exist that record as many details as the gospels. Still, they show that Jesus was a real person in history who had influence. So if someone tells you that the Bible is not the only source that mentions Jesus in the ancient world, you will know that is not correct. And I thought that was a really good point to make regarding this second aspect, that regarding Jesus, there is so much written about Jesus in a contemporary time frame Okay, we're talking about in those first 60 and 70 years after Jesus died, individuals who were alive, who witnessed these things. And that's rare among contemporary, among groups of people. In fact, you'll notice even as we go forward, some of these historians write about things that happened hundreds of years earlier. They may reference writings from historians that were of that time, but they're still writing histories like later in the 100s and 200s AD. They'll write histories about Tiberius. They'll write histories about Nero, even though this was 100 years after the fact. So it's important to recognize that just because outside sources don't record something the Gospels do, that is in no way a suggestion that it didn't happen. Because their intent is not to record about Jesus of Nazareth. That's not their purpose. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm going to use the Queen as an example. The Queen has a historian, and their job is to record the Queen stuff. Mm-hmm. But if Michael McClary has a meeting with the Queen, it's going to be recorded.
Just in passing. May not be all the details, or may not be...
And any correspondence that you have may be recorded.
Right.
So if my job was to be the historian for Pharaoh, or let's say Pilate, and I'm going to say that, Jesus was in front of Pilate 3 times, I'm going to record something about Jesus and the interactions, just like I would the 2 thieves that were on the cross with him. In passing, like you said, but it's still going to be in there.
Right.
And it confirms what the Bible says, because a source that's about Pilate mentions it as well.
And there was no reason for them to mention that if it didn't happen. And that's one of the key components. This is why Doy's going through this, is that there would be no purpose for these outside, non-biblical, non-Christian, non-supportive of Christians, these sources, to mention these things if they actually didn't happen. Why would they mention them? And that's going to be the exact point that he makes, is that this just goes to show that these things that are recorded, they did happen as the Bible says they did. So there's no reason to question anything else that the Bible claims, especially the New Testament regarding Jesus, which is the point under consideration. Any other thoughts through that? All right, so he goes in and he talks about a couple of these ancient historians and officials for whom we have records and things that they wrote. One of them, in fact, some of these we actually kind of talked about. We didn't go through a lot of their writings or anything, but we talked about some of these in our kind of the history of the church. We went past Acts and then kind of went through some of the history that we have in terms of where the Catholic Church came from and so forth. And we talked about some of these individuals kind of as we went along. But Tacitus, he was a Roman historian from about 55 to 120 AD. In his writing of the Annals, I'm assuming that's chapter 15, verse 44, or page 15, line 44, however they count those, regarding how Nero was trying to pass off the guilt for the burning of Rome to the Christians. This is what Tacitus writes. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures of a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. Obviously, these are Latin, the more Latinized terms or names for like Pontius Pilatus, and Christus would be the Latinized word for Christ. And it's interesting that Tacitus, in his writing of this, of course, Nero, it's interesting then that Tacitus acknowledges that even though Nero attempted to fasten the blame to Christians, did Tacitus think it was the Christians who burned Rome? Doesn't seem to be. Doesn't seem to be. In fact, within what Doy talks about, the fact that Nero, many people thought Nero had started the fires himself or ordered the fires to be started himself, and then he tried to deflect blame or whatnot. But certainly we have records about how Christians were tortured by Nero. In some cases, they were used as human lanterns. They were set on fire and used to light pathways and so forth. It was really bad. And then a class hated for their abominations. It's an interesting phrase that he uses here. Why do you think Romans would look at Christians as doing things that were abominations?
Because it's against the Roman law.
Okay, Roman law, or certainly the Roman spiritual belief. Just the idea of there being one God certainly was against the Roman pantheon of understanding of gods. The idea of the resurrection may have been foreign. Well, it was foreign, definitely foreign. That may be part of the abominations. Maybe the Lord's Supper. Whatever practices that were involved maybe was part of that, the abominations. But the fact that it wasn't in service to the Roman gods in and of itself would have been abominations to the Romans. And so that's part of it as well. So thoughts about the actual quote here. Doyle goes on to say, notice some facts we can gain from this record. The origin of the name Christian comes from the founder, Christus, or Christ. Okay, that's something we already know. In fact, in Acts chapter 11 and in verse 26, where were the people of the way first called Christians? Antioch. And that's interesting because Tacitus records that the name was given to the followers by the populace. And of course, we've talked before about Acts 11:26, that the phrase or the term Christian may have started out as a derogatory term, because up until Acts 11, people who were members of the church considered themselves as members of the way. Okay, they were first called Christians in Antioch, and it's possible that that was used as a derogatory term. But regardless, Tacitus records that. Christus or Christus suffered the extreme penalty, and of course, one of the most extreme penalty in the Roman rule book was crucifixion. And so Doyle extrapolates from that it's almost certainly a reference to Jesus being crucified and the fact that he was put to death under the supervision of Pontius Pilate, and then the death of Christ occurred during the reign of Tiberius. Notice just from this one little paragraph of quotes, how many different things are confirmed just from the writings in the New Testament of the Gospels and the book of Acts. Okay, just those points, just in passing. Okay, it wasn't like Tacitus was writing for the benefit of the Christians. He was writing regarding Nero. But in doing so, unintentionally, he confirmed what all the Gospels and the book of Acts say about the origins of the name Christian, about the followers and what they were doing and so forth. All of that is confirmed there. And I think that's a really interesting record about that. So thoughts on that particular point?
Well, if you think of it, for me, the thought came through, someone was writing the history of the late 50s in our society. They're going to record all the social upheaval that was going on.
Sure.
We're going to mention Rosa Parks who was passing because she was a key player.
Yeah.
You know, and so to me, that's no different. If you're reporting history about a person or a country, major things that happened that changed the culture, which we know.
Socio-political issues. Right. In the 60s, you had the Vietnam War. I mean, you had all kinds of things taking place that would have had an impact, a direct impact on the population.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. So it's no different back then. He's going to mention the struggles that the leader had, you know.
Yep.
And so, you know, it follows what we do today. So
Sure.
I'm trying to make it not work back then, but it's okay today.
Yeah.
You know, that you can have a historian that can record a non-biased account.
Right.
You know.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Tacitus further records that upon the death of Christ or Christus, the mischievous superstition was checked for a moment, but again broke out not only in Judea, but even in Rome. I thought this is actually twice this phrase mischievous superstition is brought up, which I think is kind of funny coming from the Roman perspective. seeing this, and they view it as mischievous. Because again, it's undermining the belief of the multiple gods that the Romans believed in and so forth. But notice how he records the fact that it was checked for a moment, which is to say, okay, as soon as, when Jesus died, okay, kind of settled for a couple of days, and then 3 days later, here's Jesus risen from the dead, or the apostles saw Jesus risen from the dead, and then it spread from that point on. But ultimately, when you consider the spreading of the gospel, really you had, 50 days or so from the point that Jesus was raised to Pentecost, or was put to death to Pentecost. And then ultimately you had the gospel being taught all over from that point, starting in Jerusalem and then spreading out after Acts 8. And basically Tacitus records that very thing. Again, not for the purpose of supporting the truth of the gospel in any way, or the facts that Acts records, but simply in kind of passing. Again, he calls it a mischievous superstition. It's not like he's a Christian, but he still records the facts about it. All of these verify fundamental historical details recorded in the New Testament. Thoughts or comments about that?
Well, just, if you take John Lennon, for example, you might think he was, like when he died, or Princess Diana, you might have thought they had done what Christ did, the way people responded.
The influence they had on people.
Yeah. And we think it's okay to record that.
Yeah.
And Jesus did so much more, and you had the Romans calling it a superstition. The Jews weren't behind it, another big group of people.
Yeah.
Then you had this an ever-growing band of mischievous, superstitious people.
Yeah.
So you're going to record it because it's big enough to take.
It was influential on their society at the time.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, Suetonius is another one. This is another Roman historian during the reign of Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian was around from 117 to 138 AD. So Suetonius had access to a lot of all the historical records and so forth. And so in writing about Emperor Claudius, he says, because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from the city. Okay, so this is happening in I think it was 49 AD or so, 50 AD, when this is taking place. But he records that because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances, there was a riot in one of the Jewish communities in Rome in 49 AD. And according to Suetonius, it had to do with Chrestus. And it's interesting because Doi even suggests, he says either Chrestus is just another extrapolation of Christus or Christ, or it's a misspelling of Christus. But it's Claudius trying to blame Christians for riots that had occurred in a Jewish community. So he expelled all the Jews from Rome. In Acts 18 verse 2, what couple do we find that were expelled from Rome? Aquila and Priscilla. Yeah, Aquila and Priscilla. When Paul goes to Corinth, I believe in Acts 18 verse 2, he comes across Aquila and Priscilla. They had been expelled from Rome. Same exact time frame, same exact event. Of course, Luke doesn't need to go into detail in Acts 18 as to what the political situation was as to why Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome. He doesn't go into detail about that. Does he need to? No. Okay, no more than Suetonius needs to record that anything about whether or not Christ was being taught or whatever. But what he says is at the instigation of Chrestus. And what it sounds like is that Christ was being taught in Rome. It was causing an uproar among the synagogue of the Jews. There were riots that were taking place, and Claudius just didn't want to deal with it. So he just threw them all out of Rome. So it kind of sounds like what happened there. Thoughts or comments about that point? In his recordings about Nero, Suetonius also wrote about punishing Christians after the Great Fire of Rome. He said that the Christians were a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. And Doy, it's like it'd be curious to know what the mischievous belief was. Doy tends to think it's the resurrection. Very well could have been. Maybe it was the fact that it was belief in only one God. Not that that was necessarily new. The Jews believed in one God, same God Jehovah. But the belief system of the Christians was different. It was unique. It stood apart. This confirms that Christians believed something very different from what the Romans believed and practiced, nor was the Christian faith some offshoot of Judaism or paganism. Otherwise, you'd think that Suetonius would have attached it specifically to the Jews. But he says they are a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. Thoughts or comments to that? Yes, sir.
Well, even the phrase about the mischievous religious belief, I mean, you have a phrase in the Bible about these that have turned the world upside down. Even that correlates to what's being said in the Bible. That's
a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. These things being taught have turned the world upside down. And again, that goes to what Snoop said about this was impactful on the society. And so certainly, even in passing, these things are going to have a reason to be recorded. Some of these aspects are going to have a reason to be recorded. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that supports what the Gospels say and the book of Acts. All right, next was Josephus. Most of us are probably familiar with Josephus, who was a Jewish historian. Some of us may even have a copy of the writings of Josephus. He's well known for recording the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and many of the details attached to that. He lived from 37 to 97. Generally puts him right in that time frame where the gospel's really being taught and it's spreading out everywhere. But Josephus, when you read Josephus's history, you can tell there's an obvious Jewish bias in the things that he writes. That's just because he was Jewish. Okay, that's just the way it was. And so some of the things that he records, you can kind of tell there's a little bit of a Jewish bias in it. Okay, just understanding that going into it. But it's interesting because some of the things he records, certainly not on purpose to support the Bible, but some of the things he records does correlate with what the Gospels and the book of Acts claim. He references James as being the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. Notice that Josephus didn't call him Christ. It was Jesus who was called Christ. Okay, it's Josephus disconnecting himself from believing that he was. That's in Antiquities, page 18 or chapter 18, however they enumerate that. And then Doy talks about there's a particular recording of something that Josephus writes. Some copies of that seem to suggest that Josephus is saying that Jesus was raised from the dead. Doy, he goes with the most basic of the copies, which is an Arabic copy, that records that Pilate condemned him, talking about Jesus, to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Again, that historical minimum approach. Okay, some may argue that Josephus would believe he was risen from the dead, and I agree with Doy on that. So let's go to the most fundamental, basic record, which is the fact that Josephus says that the disciples claimed he was risen from the dead, which would be much more likely as to what Josephus actually said and believed. But the fact is, does that match what the Gospels say? Yeah. Now, again, not that Josephus was trying to support the Gospels in any way. I don't think Josephus had any desire to do so. But in recording these major events that are taking place, and certainly in Judea, was the name Jesus of Nazareth kind of a big deal? Didn't Paul tell King Agrippa that these things did not happen in a corner? Okay, I know that you know about this stuff. All right, so certainly Josephus knew about it. Snoop?
Well, the Jews rejected Jesus, and if Josephus was of that same mindset, being a Jew. You know, he's not accepting Christ as his king. He's not accepting Christ as God.
Right.
But he's mentioning it because it impacted the Jewish nation.
Right.
You know, so he, as other historians did, mention it in passing.
Right.
You know, because he impacted the world they were living in.
Yeah.
So I find it hard to believe that Josephus would have written that the way he did had he believed it.
Yeah.
He would have written like the apostles did,
Yeah.
and he did not do that.
No, he
He
did.
was an eyewitness, but he mentioned that they say
Yeah.
that he rose from the dead.
Right.
But a true historian, and I mean, I learned this when I was working on my master's work. You have to write and say there's laws you follow when you're writing, and you are not supposed to put your opinion out there.
Your
just
own
state what's
commentary
out
or
there.
anything like that.
So he might have believed it, he might not, but I know
Right.
he had to write it in such a way to where he followed, protocol.
And
that's
at least an objective point of view, these are the facts.
he was just reporting history. That's all it
Right.
was. Couldn't make conclusions.
Right.
Unless it's common knowledge.
Right. Right.
Well, and so then
Yeah.
The way he
Word.
wrote it, it let you know that there were mindsets on both sides of his resurrection.
Right. That's true. At least he was fair in the fact that they reported. Okay. Josephus doesn't say, no, I don't believe this, but he says they reported that he appeared to them after 3 days.
As Dwayne said, he just wrote the facts.
Yeah. Yeah.
His personal perspective is not.
Right. And you would hope anybody seeking to report the facts would follow those rules, wouldn't you? It's a shame sometimes people forget that. All right, in another section of Antiquities, Josephus refers to John the Baptist as being put to death by Herod. Josephus suggests that Herod had a political reason to want John dead, whereas the recording in Matthew 14, verses 1 and 2, records that Herodias wanted John dead because of what John said about Herod and Herodias' unlawful marriage. I thought this was a really interesting it's not a contradiction, and this is one of the points that Dewey makes here. He says, why can't both be true? Okay, so Herod had political issues going on that John certainly was a threat, but then you have the personal element of it too, and so Dewey suggests that both were true. There was both a personal and political issue going on. And I'm not saying Dewey's wrong on that. He's very possible that that's true. The recording of Matthew 14, it makes it sound that Herod was hesitant to put John to death. First of all, we know that that Herod, rather, in chapter 14, verse 5, he wanted to put John to death, but he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. And then after Herodias' daughter danced and he promised her whatever she wanted, and she says John the Baptist had on a platter, it says he was sorry, but he'd made the promise, so he sent John off to be killed. So another thought process, Dewey doesn't discuss this, but it was something I was thinking about. It's not impossible that Josephus, wanting to keep the personal issues of Herod out of the recording and paint Herod in the best possible light, because Herod was a ruler of the Jews, revised history a little bit. Okay? And I think it's interesting because sometimes you see individuals, because of their bias, sometimes they maybe focus in on one particular aspect. Maybe the political had nothing to do with it. In fact, Matthew 14 suggests there wasn't anything political going on, or at least Herod didn't want to kill John because he was afraid of what the people were going to do. But what Josephus specifically says, and I didn't type out the whole thing word for word what Josephus said there, but it almost made it sound like Herod was looking for a reason to kill John. That doesn't really seem to fit with what Matthew records. And so it's just interesting that Josephus kind of put it in a political light, whereas the Gospels say it was personal. It was a personal situation, particularly with Herodias. Not necessarily with Herod, but with Herodias. Thoughts on that? Yeah.
that he killed John.
And that's the point. Regardless, Josephus records that John did exist, John the Baptist, that Herod ordered John to be killed in prison. Okay, when you get down to what it ultimately shows is that did the Bible make up, or did the New Testament writers just make up this figure, John the Baptist? Nope. Okay, Josephus records he existed. Any thoughts or comments on that? All right. You have Thallus. He was an ancient historian somewhere around AD 52. He wrote a history of the Eastern Mediterranean world, beginning with the Trojan War. That writing of history no longer exists, but other ancient writers have quoted from it. One such writer was Julius Africanus in AD 221, and he writes about the darkness over all the earth when Jesus was on the cross, which we see in Matthew 27. And he refers to Thallus, and he mentions how that Thallus also referenced that a period of darkness took place at that time. And so Julius Africanus says, this darkness, Thallus, in the third book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. I thought it was really interesting that Thallus, he's not a Christian, and he's not seeking to in any way, in fact, if anything, he's trying to subvert the call it a miracle, I guess, of the darkness over all the earth while Jesus was on the cross. In doing so, he called it an eclipse of the sun. Okay? And I really like what Doy's observation here was. The report of the darkness while Jesus was on the cross was well known, even by an individual who was not a Christian. And Thallus, an unbeliever, in an apparent attempt to deny any supernatural element of what happened, tried to argue that the darkness was merely an eclipse of the sun. But that speaks volumes. When unbelievers try to argue for a natural explanation of something supernatural, they are verifying something actually did happen. If nothing at all had happened, they would not feel the need to explain it away. I think that was a really good observation to show that Thallus, not only was he not a Christian, but it would seem as though he was trying to offer a scientific explanation as to why this happened, that it had nothing to do with God or Jesus dying on the cross. Instead, it just happened to be a solar eclipse, which says that was there darkness over all the earth? That's what it says. That's what it suggests, that even a non-Christian in an attempt to disprove some supernatural element to it incidentally confirms that the Gospels, what they recorded about darkness over all the earth, was accurate. I thought that was a great observation. Snoop?
And science today can go back and tell you that things weren't lined up for an eclipse at that time.
Yeah.
So you have two records, one from a biblical standpoint, one from a secular standpoint, and then you have science on the third leg of that tripod that says there's no way there was an eclipse that day,
right,
because the moon and sun weren't, the sun wasn't in the right place to have an eclipse.
Right. Yeah.
Either way, you've got two recordings of the same event.
Right. Yeah. Anything else about Thallus here? Pliny the Younger and Emperor Trajan is the last one he goes into detail about. Pliny the Younger, he was a Roman author, he was an administrator, he was a governor of Asia Minor. Emperor Trajan was the emperor at the time. Pliny, he's dealing with the Christians. There's issues because people are getting all in uproar over the Christians in Bithynia. And so he writes to Emperor Trajan because he doesn't know what to do about it. This is a letter that's dated to AD 112. He's concerned about the influence of the Christians and was unsure what to do. He says that Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day and that they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God. I thought that was really, I'd never read this part about what Pliny the Younger has recorded here, that they met on a fixed day and that they sang a hymn to Christ. I thought that was really, really interesting. All right, we will stop there. We will pick up with Pliny and Trajan, and we will finish chapter 8 next week, Lord willing. Thank you, everybody.